So in fact, the China story to show the rest of the world, if you really wanted to clean up, right? Because if you really believe air quality is killing your people, and we can now show the data that it does do that, right? Well, then if you wanted to do something as a politician, well, there's a pathway. Spend money on those things. It works.
Welcome to Asia Climate Finance, your front row seat to the policies, investments, and actors shaping climate business and finance across Asia Pacific. Subscribe now so others find this essential guide to Asia's climate economy, and note the disclaimers at the end. Now over to the host, analyst, investor, and author, Joseph Giacobelli.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you may be listening from. Welcome to Asia Climate Finance. It's been a little while, so let me start with a quick apology. I've been juggling the day job of managing money while also launching my second book, Powering the Unstoppable Green Shift. That has taken more time than expected, so thank you for your patience. Today, I'm in Hong Kong with someone who needs absolutely no introduction in this region, Dr. Christine Loh. Christine is one of Asia's most respected voices on environmental policy. She's a professor at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, HKUST, a former policymaker and a long-time thinker on how governments and markets can drive real climate progress. She brings clarity, context, and a huge amount of lived experience to this conversation. We talk about China's rise as a clean tech powerhouse and how national mobilization cleaned up Beijing's air. Christine explains how that effort evolved into a broader mandate for ecological progress. We look at the extraordinary growth of solar and wind, and we ask when renewables might finally overtake coal. We also turn to Hong Kong. We discuss the city's dependence on mainland energy, the scale of retrofitting needed across thousands of aging buildings, and what it will take to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. Along the way, we touch on deep green construction materials, climate science in insurance, and a few other threads. It's a wide-ranging and very grounded discussion. As always, if you have comments or ideas, please send them to the email address at the top of the show notes. Now, let's join the conversation. Christine, thank you so much for joining me again on the Asia Climate Finance podcast. It's really, really good to have you. And this time we talk face-to-face in Hong Kong, so it's absolutely wonderful. How are things with you?
I'm very well, thank you. So nice to see you.
Thank you so much, Christine. So I wanted to have a discussion about what's been happening in Hong Kong and in China in terms of whether we're just talking about climate reporting, whether we're talking about sustainability, the policy side, etc., in terms of trends, so that we can basically better understand the future of where we're going. I think one of the headlines is that now it's increasingly recognized that China is the clean tech leader globally. That's no longer disputed. And Hong Kong obviously can piggyback on that, being part of China. So could we first do almost like a State of the Union assessment of where we're at in Hong Kong and in China?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that finally I think the world recognized something is happening in China, and clean tech, clean energy is very much a part of it. I mean, for myself, the first time I went to China was in the 1980s, and I remember very clearly what that was like. At that time, there was no power, brownouts, just not very reliable energy. And then, of course, from the 80s to the 90s, it was China industrializing, building out power system. And what it has, of course, was coal power. And it wasn't really until the late 1990s that China recognized that, well, actually, our environmental condition has deteriorated. I mean, they recognized that this was coming up with pollution that was coming out of all their factories. And I remember that very well because in Hong Kong, by the mid-1990s, we were beginning to see serious air quality. So because of that period, people in Hong Kong recognized that this had something to do with the expansion of factories just across the border. So that moment kind of was one where people talked about it's time to clean up. But of course, the transition to cleaning up actually took some time. And we also remember a number of dates that I think are critical as we think back to think forward for China. 2008 was the year of the Winter Olympics, right? And 2 or 3 years before then, when China was bidding for the Olympics, one of the important milestones is, well, you've got to have 2 months of clean air, right? So that became the moment, that is sort of indication, right? Can you do it or not? Yeah. And actually, if we now look back at emissions data, history, and so on, what you see is China thinking through, how do I give 2 months of blue sky in 2008 in Beijing for the Olympics? And actually, for those of us who were involved with air quality science, which includes my colleagues at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, we actually spent time thinking about how to do that. We worked with the main team in mainland China on doing all kinds of tests and experiments and so on. Just to cut this story short, but it's important, because during that period, it was such a big deal for China. There was no alternative to not having blue sky. And when they realized that you have to shut down a lot of things, and when you shut down factories from a wide radius, well, actually, you do get cleaner air. But during that period, they actually learned a lot because they measured everything. They tried everything. Fast forward, by the time we got to the following year, 2010, it was the Shanghai Expo. That too had to have relatively clean air. Right? So what I'm saying is China had a number of major events that for the Chinese government were events that kicked them into action. And it became national mobilization, right, to clean up. Okay, then you kind of go forward to 2012. So in 2012, the Chinese Communist Party changed its constitution to adding in ecological progress. That's the word that they use. Again, you can see the pacing, right, of doing experiments to clean up for big events and then leading to actually the ruling party in China changing its constitution to make it a mandate that you have to make ecological progress. Then by 2018, 5 years later, China changed the national constitution to achieve something that the Chinese call ecological civilization. So this is now something philosophical. It's a guiding plan. So by then, the key policymakers in China were quite clear. We're going to have to continue to grow, but growth has to be ecologically sound. This was a big, big moment, right? Then by 2013 and 2014, China started all these various plans, fight against pollution, including air quality. So, okay, 2013-14, that was about 10 years ago today, right? So but from the time of 2008 with the Beijing Olympics, with all the tests that had been done then, China was actually practicing all kinds of things to make improvements, as well as to train many, many people from universities and governments to go and measure pollution, right? So the learning pace in China was mobilized on a massive scale. By the time 2018 came along, China was kind of much more ready than it was before. And then now we take it forward, it was quite clear. Again, the next range of the 5-year plans and so on was to say, we're going to grow, and the growth has to come from sustainability. And then in more recent years, digitalization, right? That had to do with AI's development. Then clean energy became even more important. So that's why I think today you see the rollout of something that China has been trying to deal with, because energy lies at the core. No energy, no growth, right? So you've got to clean up energy. But at the same time, China has been cleaning up its natural assets. So massive cleanup of rivers and ecology protection and so on. So right now, we're seeing the results, the collective results, going back to pre-Olympic days of all these years of mass mobilization.
But apart from climate change-related policy and ecological or environmental policies improving, at the same time, we've seen the business side.
Yes.
The wind farms, solar, and all of the rest, and even nuclear, growing very, very quickly. Do you think that it was purely the economics that drove it, or it was just a new opportunity given by government? Because I don't really remember the Chinese going out and saying, oh, we want our wind equipment manufacturers to be the number ones in the world or whatever it is. I don't really remember them saying that. So,
well, they kind of did, but maybe it was not so loud that people heard it. But actually, if you look back at the history and follow it, you do see it. The year of, I think it was COP15 in Copenhagen, that was also the first year that senior leaders, it was Wen Jiabao, who was then the premier.
Right.
It was the first time someone of that kind of senior position went to these climate change international meetings. I think when they were there, because the record is there, it was also the year in Copenhagen where things was a bit of a mess. It was during the time of the Obama administration. President Obama from the US was there. And kind of Copenhagen didn't quite make it. It was supposed to take climate change policy to the next stage. So I think for the Chinese, they've said, okay, now we're on the big stage, but we don't quite know what we're doing. So again, that touched the point of China thinking about economically, financially, I mean, how do we stick all of this together? But I think because the Chinese leadership was quite clear about the science, they kept learning about the science. I know a very well-known professor at Tsinghua University who is in air quality science. And he is the one who has gone over the years to actually give classes to the Politburo members. I think one of the things about the Chinese leadership is many of them do come from a technical background.
Yes.
And so looking at evidence, looking at numbers is not strange to them. All right? In fact, they demand it. If I'm going to make policy, what is it that I really need to do? Can you measure something for me? Know that if I spent this money, it's actually going to work. So they work very closely with all their technical think tanks and the universities. I think in China, it's perhaps one of the few places where the knowledge that comes from science is matched with the policymakers sitting together. Because, okay, how am I going to clean up air quality? Because it became a political problem, right? The smog became a political problem. And you might remember the other premier before Wen Jiabao, Zhu Rongji. And Zhu Rongji was the one who said, well, I need to see the evidence, right? So they have a practice of working together and then mobilizing, right? The other thing that the Chinese Communist Party is really excellent at is to mobilize resources.
Yes.
Because once they make a decision, it flows down from the national government to the provincial government to the city governments, right? Everybody has to have targets. So when they said, I'm going to fight air quality, it was really quite serious all over the country. So what do you do? Well, you have to replace your coal plants, you have to put in scrubbers. I mean, you have to do 1,001 things. And they allocated the money to do all of that throughout the country. So in fact, the China story to show the rest of the world, if you really wanted to clean up, right? Because if you really believe air quality is killing your people, and we can now show the data that it does do that, right? Well, then if you wanted to do something as a politician, well, there's a pathway. Spend money on those things. It works.
So it was really, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it was really the strength of the signal from the central government that also allowed, and which filtered down all the way to the county governments, which kind of drove private business, because there's a lot of private business involved in the manufacturing of clean energy equipment.
Yeah, well, private businesses, many of them are state-owned enterprises, the private sector, right? Now, the state-owned enterprises are the ones that run the big energy systems.
They have to follow that.
So let's say that the coal power plants, right? So once the central government accepts that we got to clean them up, so there were two things that they did. One is, okay, clean up technology, right? The second thing that they did was, okay, the cleanup technology must include actually going higher up in the technology. So therefore, today's the cleanest coal plants, if you have to use coal, comes from China. Because they also knew that if you're going to have to keep burning coal, you're going to have to be the cleanest. And at those days, right, we're going back 15 plus years, they didn't have too many other alternatives. They also knew that by about the year 2000, they better start looking at renewables. And then if you track solar, the growth of solar from hardly anything to every 5 years, right, you see what they have. The trajectory is just amazing. And what is that an evidence of? That's the evidence of consistent policy from the government. It's the also that you have to keep investing to make it happen. And you have to really kind of believe in this, because we have seen other governments around the world where they make a policy, whatever it is, right? Clean energy, medical investments. Right. So, but if you have a change of government and they step back, then you have a break. So in China, you actually have massive mobilization of technology, talent, right? Because the two goes together in a way, because you're funding it, right? Therefore, all the things is how you mobilize massively on a national scale. And this is what the Chinese are good at. It goes back to when we think about building the Grand Canal, building the Great Wall. What is the Chinese good at? The Chinese are doing big things because they always had to.
But what's wrong at is also there are a lot of private companies, like not state-owned, that got into the clean energy game, and including some energy efficiency companies and some others.
That's right.
So those were like almost motivated by the policy, the consistency of the policies that the government had. And now we're seeing one of my favorite examples, I don't remember the exact number, but I think it's something like this 200 electric vehicle manufacturers in China, which is probably 192 too many. But so that kind of shows it's not regulated by government, because if government regulated it, say, okay, we just need 3 or 4 big companies to be the champions, to go out or whatever. But the fact that you've got much more than 10 is you've got this competitive kind of side of things, which I think not everybody appreciates.
Yeah, no. It's actually a model that needs to be understood from perhaps how the Chinese have in practice, right? That's how it is. So whenever they wanted to promote something, they kind of let everybody bloom, right? And they say, if you do this, then there is be some favorable incentive subsidies and so on. Right. So of course, then people start growing, right? Okay, well, at some stage, and we've seen this over and over again, there is then too many of these companies. These companies are not all surviving. So some will just die, right? And then the next stage is when the government intervenes and said, it's time for you to aggregate. Right? Because there are so many of you, a lot of you have died because you didn't quite make your business model, right? Didn't quite work for you. But now we have quite a number that have kind of survived. But to go into the next stage, maybe what you really need to do is to reduce the numbers. And how do you reduce the numbers? The state kind of, again, has maybe some incentives, or actually they even say, in this province, there are too many of you, right? So we want to help you to actually aggregate yourselves, right, into maybe 3 companies instead of having 10 companies, right? So there is this process going on. So eventually, the ones that are stronger, they're proven to you in a way that they've survived, that you're now given a better future. So we see this way of operation again and again in China on different products.
So we talked about the kind of longer history, the short-term history. What's the status now? What exactly is going on in terms of like policies and how those policies are being executed?
The next stage is a really interesting stage, but let's stick with energy for now. So we know the story because this is the bit that is widely reported outside China, and people are beginning to see, wow, from year to year, you've now built so much renewable energy. So the renewable energy capacity we know is now more than coal, right? So the next stage is, okay, what is the system integration that you need for more of that to be used, right? So there is also now a very robust and very capable battery technology. So what I'm saying is there are all these apart from the power generation, right, and the power equipment, the transmission lines and all of that, because that's all there now. Then the batteries are now also there. They're all kind of growing at the same time. And these people are now able to also articulate a much fuller picture of how they can all dovetail together, which the government has bought into. I think private investors can also see this. So it's a very lively market for energy, new energy, clean energy, whatever you want to call it in China. And now you're having also foreign investments coming in and seeing that this is the future, being able to invest. So it's a very interesting time. What we are now going to watch for is, when is it now in the future that all this suddenly comes together much better so that you can actually flip over and use more renewable energy because the capacity is now there than coal? I mean, that will be like the magic moment in China where suddenly everything starts to flip. Now, the government, they tell you, right, they want to achieve peak coal by 2030. Now we think if you get all this integration, right, there's other stuff together, you should be able to get there, or maybe even before. Is that flip in that moment?
I see. Where does Hong Kong fit into all this?
In Hong Kong, we are very fortunate because our energy, we have very highly reliable electricity, right? Everybody knows that. And I teach in my class about how lucky we are to live in Hong Kong. And I ask my students, I said, what floor do you live on? And says, I live on the 25th floor. And there was one year where the student, last year actually, a student put her hand up and said, I live on the 71st floor. Right? This is an apartment building in Hong Kong, right? And I said, well, you win, right? Hands down. And then we talked about, well, actually, if the electricity in Hong Kong is not highly reliable, you're never going to be able to get home. And so the whole development of the city, very high density, high-rise buildings. We have this magic subway system, right, that runs very smoothly, lots of rail lines being built and so on. This high energy reliability doesn't come about if we didn't have all the pieces in the right place. So a lot of that energy also is related to China. So, for example, if we were talking about gas, gas field, where does it come from? It comes from a gas field in the South China Sea, or it's coming from a Chinese contract buying by pipeline, Turkmenistan, right? But it goes through China and then comes down to Hong Kong. And of course, in Hong Kong itself, more than a quarter of our electricity comes from a nuclear plant across the border in China. What I'm saying is our reliance on energy sources that actually comes from mainland China is huge. Point number one. Number two is Hong Kong is now interested, really, because we have our own targets and so on, that we need to clean up. We have to have carbon neutrality by 2050. That means we need new contracts with our electricity suppliers. Well, where are we going to get it from? Again, the China component, the clean energy from the southern China grid, or building new plants, right, not very far away, becomes vital. So that really is our future. That's number one. Number two, perhaps more importantly, is Hong Kong and our leaders can see so clearly now that the Chinese policy trajectory is clean energy, is sustainability, is technology and innovation. So I think I think that actually gives us a picture of where we need to be ourselves.
So how's progress in Hong Kong in terms of like regulatory policies? And I mean, do you think that the government has put in place enough green lights to allow for these developments? I mean, apart from climate finance, because I know the Hong Kong government is big on promoting climate finance in all sorts of ways.
Yeah.
But do you think that there's enough policies out there to drive change?
Well, with energy, at least, we have existing contracts, right, with our two power companies. Right. So on that basis, the next change where you can do something new and different comes in the next few years for negotiation, where the new contract will start after 2033. So the next 5 years is actually very important because we're going to have to go towards something, right? Mm-hmm. And the going towards something inevitably has to be linked to mainland China. Mm-hmm. So I hope in that space that we can be more ambitious and see clean energy, how we're going to price it, how we're going to tap it down. So there's a structural engineering side and there's a pricing side. And then we're beginning to see more companies in Hong Kong, both big and small, going into efficiency, the technology, the innovation side. I'd like to think that Hong Kong people are getting more interested in energy itself because in the current contract, many people have put solar panels on their roofs. Now, of course, it's still relatively small because our rooftops are small, but it kind of gives a new sense to the use of energy. And maybe people will be more interested in the future in technology that we can use ourselves personally and in our homes that will save energy.
How far behind is Hong Kong from China?
It depends on how you're looking at it, because we have already faced down coal. Mm-hmm. So in a way, if China wanted to point to a city that is within Greater China, they could point to Hong Kong, that we've stopped building coal plants back in the late 1990s. I think when people say we want Hong Kong to do more, is that, well, since we did that already so long ago, can we do something that further goes out there? But there are some things that we can do right now. We can think about how to reprice the clean energy that we have, right? How do you want to sell that cleaner energy? So, for example, more than a quarter of our energy is actually nuclear. Do you want that to be worth more, so that they could go to perhaps industry and commerce? What I'm saying is you got to think of not just the hardware, of energy. This is a good time to actually think about saving energy, how to sell energy in a different way. There's so many, the more the financial and the service side of energy, I think in Hong Kong could be much better.
The service. In terms of corporations, so we know that in China, they're pretty tightly regulated, so they don't have a lot of choice. If they're told to do climate reporting, they'll just report. Whether it's good quality or bad quality, that's a different discussion. What about in Hong Kong? How do you think? How do you see the climate transition? Because one of the kind of criticisms that I heard, and this is not just Hong Kong, it's applies to Europe, applies for US. Yes. There's a lot of quasi-greenwashing in the sense that they say, okay, well, yeah, we'll do it because we have to do it. But as far as they're concerned, it's just a tick in the box exercise. So there isn't a real commitment to change. And I think it was mentioned an example that some entities like fund managers now will make an allowance for a dirty, quote unquote, company as long as they've got a transition plan and they've got so they won't get a green tick, but they'll get a kind of yellow tick because it's but not a red one, not a red one. So how are we doing in Hong Kong? Because I know you're quite close to that space.
Yeah, I think we can point to quite a lot of the listed companies because they have to write reports.
Right.
And I would say, like everywhere in the world, there's a group of companies we call the front runners, right? The front runners, inevitably, their management, the governance of the company requires them to kind of really do something. And it's interesting to look at these companies over the last 10 years, because that's been really the history of doing more, right? And how they've gone about it. I think today we've now entered the beginning of the next stage, which is it's not enough to say you've got a target and a timeline, because nobody actually knows how you're going to get there. And one hopes your senior management and your board actually knows how to get there. Now people are beginning to talk about, how do I get there? What is it that I have to do? There's actually a very good report out from one of our listed property companies, Hang Lung. It's just put out a document that I'm actually asking my students to read at university. What it does is they say we're a property company. We have a portfolio in Hong Kong and we have a portfolio in mainland China. They have looked at what is it that they have to do to get to net zero by 2050. Now, in order to do that, they actually have to say if they actually list out what they call a light green transition or deep green transition. The deep green transition is the one that will allow them to build new buildings. So this is expansion through new buildings. And what they're saying is it means that actually they have to be able to buy green steel. They have to be able to buy and use green cement.
Right.
Now, only if they could do that, and they're not going to produce it, right? So they have to actually work with producers who can do that. They said if they can go deep green, then they have an opportunity to build new buildings. So expand their portfolio through new buildings. However, if that's not possible, then what do you do about other strategies? Is it to retrofit your old building? Or maybe you have to do both, obviously, right? Because you need to be net zero. So very interesting. They talk about what is the technology you need to do, what is the trade-off you're prepared to do. So I think that kind of thinking is what you really expect companies to do. And they've kind of laid it out there. So I think once somebody is doing something like that, you can ask other companies, right? And how you're doing it. So the next stage of conversation, I think, will be more specific. And that's a good thing. And to be a front runner, right? It also means the company has to go and find producers of green steel and cement and actually show how you're actually going to do it. You don't sit back and wait, right? Because if you think your strategy to grow involves maybe building new buildings in another part of some market, then as a portfolio, you've got to be able to source these deep green transitional materials. So very interesting.
If you were to take your crystal ball, we know that China is going to continue to accelerate because, especially, I mean, in Asia Climate Finance, we don't talk about politics because it's not my area of expertise, but given the, let's call it, geopolitical earthquakes that we've had of recent, especially in the Middle East, so that energy security drive for China is going to be anything but stronger. So don't want to rely on imported oil, don't want to rely on imported gas. So we know that kind of pathway. What about Hong Kong's pathway? Because it's been disappointing in the sense of, for those of us who have observed Hong Kong for a long time, that there's so much hope, so much potential. It's a wealthy jurisdiction, very well-educated population, well-educated government. And we could just do so much more and perhaps contribute to China's transition. But we seem to be going about it quite slowly. So if you were just to guesstimate where we're going to be in 10, 20 years from now in Hong Kong, how do you see it?
I like to think that we can use our own problems, right? So one of the problems that we have is retrofitting buildings. We have a lot of buildings that are getting older and older. And to retrofit buildings is not just even about energy, but of course you're going to do energy, right? Energy, water efficiency, these are critical, but also the well-being. Yeah. And as you have younger people who are more digitally interested, how can we wrap that really into an opportunity, right? Now, however, to be able to do that, I think there are a lot of policies and thinking, our own thinking about this, that are disjointed and disconnected. We are going to need government to actually make a policy that says retrofitting buildings is a great opportunity for the future, right? For economic growth, well-being, and good health of the people, and so on, yeah? So you need to think through what is the public sector trigger that you're going to get that into place. And in our last policy address, this is in October 2025, we had one sentence in the Chief Executive Policy Address that says they want to accelerate the market for existing building retrofit. Now, it's important to have it there because that kind of wakes up the administration, the policymakers. But now, okay, since government wants to do that, what is it that we now need to do, both in the public and private sector, to do that? So we know actually all the problems, the disjointed benefits, right? So somebody has to spend heavy capex to do that. But who gets the benefit? Is it the owners? Is it the tenant? And who is it along the way that will get what kind of benefit? Now, the finance sector tends to look at this as, well, if you can do something and it fits in with the way that I'm willing to lend or invest, then I'll do it. But no, I think that's the old way. We need to collectively see how to invest or how to put some public money and private money into retrofitting a lot. We're talking about thousands, right, of Hong Kong's building. Then I think people see, wow, this is actually an economic opportunity. So what is it that you need to do there? So Hong Kong, we're now entering that discussion, which I'm quite excited about. So as I said, one is supply side, right? Where are you going to get the power from? The other one is the demand side, which is, this is what it is. And I think once we sort out some funding and what is the policy needs, this could be replicated in other markets.
Interesting. Going back to the kind of climate, if I can talk about a little bit about the environment, climate reporting as well. Do you feel that what the Hong Kong Stock Exchange did maybe last year or the year before, I forgot, is going to be extended to smaller enterprises as well? And if so, then how are smaller enterprises going to cope given that they're small?
Yeah, well, I think because they're not listed, the stock exchange cannot directly ask them to do something. So it's indirect. So it will be through smaller companies doing business with listed companies. The listed companies are going to ask them for that data. So I think that's kind of number one drive. To some extent, that's happening. The second thing is, I think this happens to any business, even bigger business. Your earlier point about companies saying, oh, this ESG stuff, is it really serious? And can I just tick the box, right? This is compliance, right? I'll just do it. But I don't know if this is really going to help me. I was asked this question by an executive group of students, and I thought about it, and I said, well, actually, let us discuss this in a different way, right? Because do you believe that in the digital world, now, because that's also about you managing your business, right? So that you can know where to invest or squeeze more benefit out of the money that you're spending more, right? And everybody says, yes, we know that. And do you believe that in the future, you yourself want to know a lot more about your business? Never mind about whether it's about environment, right? But everything. And they said, yes. I said, well, if you believe in that, that means your ESG becomes much easier. You're just measuring that as well, right? So, but right now, you're focusing on looking at that and saying ESG is not so relevant to me. But at the same time, when you're looking at digital improvement, you are looking at collecting more data.
Yes.
Right. So then actually you're just using this. You're now only looking at it from compliance. But actually, if you're looking at it from your total business, does that make sense? And everybody has said, yes, that makes sense. Yeah. So if you're looking at things from a digital perspective, they're actually spending lots of money doing that, right? So I think we're just missing a little component here. And I do believe that over time, when people become much more data sensitive and younger people kind of enter the business, they'll find it much easier to do that, whether you're a little cafe or you're a big listed company. It will change. The compliance is no longer seen as a hassle, but just as part of what I do. I have the data.
For the final kind of point, I wanted to talk a little bit about HKUST, because I know you've got some initiatives, and I think, again, from the concept of looking at this from a bottom-up, or if you want to call it grassroots, but it's more like a bottom-up approach. From the economics perspective, there's a few things that you're working on. So could you tell us a little bit about those?
Well, I'll tell you something that I'm doing personally, but also some of the things I get really excited, but I've seen my colleagues are doing it, and we're trying to see how to do it together. So I just throw out a couple of them. This whole thing about these existing buildings, right? Every time I look outside the window in Hong Kong, I see tens of thousands of buildings that need retrofitting, right? Yes. So I've been working on this for a long time. I think now we've got government's interest, and so how can we stick it together better? So this is what I'm spending time doing. The other thing that has become very sexy in Hong Kong is something called nature-based solutions. So people are saying, oh, can you really do nature? And how do we price nature? How do we measure whether some tree is growing, or to what extent is it absorbing carbon? And so I see a lot of interest in understanding how nature performs and how to use that to help government policy, because a lot of the nature conservation is about public land. Right? It's government, the coastline or the forest, whatnot. And then there is development land, right? So government land, they want to be sold or it's private land, but to get development right, you have to follow guidelines from the government and so on. So Hong Kong, something that I think want to clap, that I think very recently, government is now providing a set of new guidelines on nature-based solutions for development, for infrastructure. So that's a great start, because that triggers a whole new way of thinking. So Hong Kong, I think, is justifiably proud of that. And we are now, again, hosting diverse disciplines to work together to articulate how we can get private funding, private investments into nature conservation. And what is it that we need? The third example I want to give is, these are all my very techie colleagues at HKUST. So we're looking at, okay, let's say we have all the technology, drones and robots and sensors, everything that you can use today. We can do a digital twin of a nature park in Hong Kong. Right? Now, once you can do that, you can actually manage it better because you're doing it real time, right? So this is something of great interest to actually a lot of people, to ecologists, to government that has to manage these nature parks, to providing also ecologists with how are those trees growing, right? So we're now, but as I said, there's a number of different techie disciplines from my colleagues in different departments that want to build something like that. So that's just one example. So I'm very excited by all this kind of stuff.
There was one project you were doing a couple of years back, which was completed, called the carbon counter for small, medium enterprises.
Yes. Well, that is out there. And actually, my colleagues have improved or expanded that to one of the Southeast Asian countries. We're being asked if we can do that. So the problem is getting people to use it.
Right.
What we cannot...
Education part.
Yes. So the technical side for us is not the challenge. It's really... Because we're a university, right? I mean, we have no capacity to go and get people to use this kind of stuff. So the thing really is, who is going to help with the popularization of something like that?
Right.
Yeah. So that's one of the disconnects, right? Between the techie innovators and the users.
Right. Well, it's all process of education, but the education.
That's right.
What do you do? Do you use Instagram, or do you use your YouTube? I mean, which way are you going to go?
Well, we're trying to say to government, since they have supported us in doing this, that maybe they can take it to the next step.
I remember that you also had mentioned the private sector participation in cooperating with HKUST in some of the projects.
Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, one of the very exciting ones is to use science, use climate science. And we're now working very closely with the insurance sector to look at risk, how we predict extreme climate, looking at claims data that we're given on a confidential basis by the insurance sector, and what we can come up with that will help the insurance sector to predict and to assess risk and creating new products in insurance. So we're very excited about that. We should have some new information coming out later this year in 2026.
Okay, great. Well, listen, Christine, I really, really, really appreciate your time today. It's been a really comprehensive conversation about China and about Hong Kong. Always enjoy it, and hopefully we can do that sometime again soon.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So nice to see you.
Thanks.
Please note that the Asia Climate Finance podcast is provided for educational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice. Any information discussed should not be relied upon for making investment decisions. Listeners should always seek advice from a suitably qualified and authorized investment professional. The views and opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of their current or former employers or of the podcast host or producers.